In 1873, a British archaeologist named George Smith was sorting through damaged clay tablets inside the British Museum when he found something that stopped him cold. The tablet in his hands described a great flood, a man warned by the gods, animals taken in pairs. It was older than Genesis by 1,000 years. Smith reportedly stood up, walked around the room, and started taking his clothes off. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind. He hadn't. He just understood what he was holding. The world's oldest story. And it had been sitting in a museum basement, unread, for 26 years. That same collection, the tablets pulled from the ruins of Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq, contains material that received far less attention than the flood story. Not because it is less significant, because what it describes is harder to absorb. One cluster of tablets, cross-referenced by scholars across the last century, deals with a subject that every civilization has tried to understand and none has fully explained. What actually happens after a person dies? Not symbolically, not metaphorically, step by step, with a kind of structural precision that reads less like religion and more like an engineering manual. And the reason most people have never heard any of this in detail is simpler than a conspiracy. It is that the translations are difficult, the academic literature is dense, and the implications, if you follow them to their logical end, are deeply uncomfortable. Subscribe if you want more of this. This channel covers the things that don't make it into the textbooks. Let's start with what the Sumerians actually believe a human being was. Because before you can understand what they said about death, you need to understand what they thought was dying. The Sumerians described the human being as a composite structure. Not a single unified soul inside a body, but a layered construction made of distinct components that each behaved differently when the body stopped functioning. The physical body was called the Balak. It returned to the earth. Standard. Every tradition says something similar. But there were 3 other layers the Sumerians identified that did not return to the earth. The first was the gidim, the shade or ghost, the surviving imprint of consciousness that outlasts the physical body. The second was the Z, the life force, the animating breath, the thing that made the difference between a living person and a corpse. And the third was something called the Me, a term Sumerian scholars have argued about for decades. It doesn't translate cleanly. The closest approximation is something like a person's encoded nature. The patterns that made you who you were. Your accumulated experience, your identity, your specific configuration of awareness. The reason that third layer matters is what the tablets say happens to it. The core text here is one of the oldest surviving pieces of writing on Earth. It is called the Descent of Inanna into the underworld. Inanna was the Sumerian goddess of love and war. The story of her descent predates Homer by more than 2,000 years. Most mainstream treatments of it frame it as myth, a seasonal metaphor for the dying of crops, the goddess going underground in winter and returning in spring. That reading is not wrong, but it is not complete. Read the text carefully, and something else emerges. The underworld in this text is called Kur, the Great Below. And it is not described the way myths usually describe the afterlife. There are no rivers of fire. There is no weighing of souls against a feather. There is no heaven and no hell. The underworld in the Sumerian system is described almost bureaucratically. It has walls. It has gates, 7 of them specifically. It has administrators. It has a queen, Ereshkigal, who governs it according to fixed laws. And those laws are described as absolute. They apply to gods and humans equally. The Sumerians call them the Me of Death, the coded rules by which the death process runs. Not divine will, not punishment. Rules. A system. Here is where the text gets strange. As Inanna passes through each of the 7 gates on her way into the underworld, something is removed from her. At the first gate, her crown. At the second, her earrings. At the third, her necklace. At the fourth, her breastplate. At the fifth, her ring. At the sixth, her measuring rod. At the seventh, the last garment covering her body. Scholars have cataloged this as symbolic, the stripping of divine power, the humiliation of descent, and maybe that is part of it. But notice what is actually being removed. These are not random objects. In Sumerian cosmology, these specific items are associated with memory, identity, and the accumulation of a person's life experience. The crown represents authority, what you have built. The necklace and ring represent relationships, who you loved. The breastplate represents what protected you, your defenses, your fears, your accumulated caution. By the time Inanna reaches the throne of Ereshkigal, she has nothing left. She does not know who she is. She does not remember what she knew. And this, the tablets strongly imply, is not specific to Inanna. This is what the underworld does to everyone who passes through it. The seven gates are not obstacles. They are a process. Now here is the part that most treatments of Sumerian death texts skip past. The underworld as described in these tablets is not the end state. It is a processing stage. The Sumerians did not describe Kur as a permanent destination. They described it as a place where the dead are held, stripped, and then returned. The word they used for this return is not resurrection in the Christian sense, a body rising from a grave. The return described in the tablets is a cycling. The gidim, the surviving consciousness, passes through the gates, loses its memory and identity across those 7 stages, and then re-enters the world in a new body with no recollection of what came before. This is not a fringe interpretation of one obscure tablet. This framework appears across the Sumerian corpus in fragments that have been authenticated and published in peer-reviewed scholarship for over a century. The gidim is described repeatedly as something that can haunt the living when it does not complete the passage, when something holds it back and it cannot fully descend. But the default trajectory, when nothing disrupts it, is descent, stripping, and return. What is disturbing about this is not the recycling itself. What is disturbing is the framing. The Sumerians did not describe this as liberation. They did not describe it as natural. They described it as designed. The me of death, the rules governing the process, are presented in the texts as having been established deliberately by beings who understood how the system worked because they built it. The Anunnaki in Sumerian texts are not gods in the way the word God is used in Western tradition. They are described as beings from elsewhere who arrived on Earth, established civilization, and designed the conditions of human existence, including its end conditions, including what happens after the body stops. Now, before you dismiss that as ancient mythology, consider how many separate traditions describe the same underlying mechanism and arrived at it independently. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was compiled over centuries from texts attributed to the teacher Padmasambhava in the 8th century CE. It describes the bardo, the state between death and rebirth, as a series of stages through which consciousness passes. At each stage, the dying person is confronted with visions that test their ability to maintain awareness. If they fail to recognize the nature of those visions, if they are pulled into confusion, fear, or desire, they are swept into rebirth without choice, without memory, without any continuity of the self that just died. The mechanism is different in its cultural language. The underlying structure is the same. Stage dissolution, memory loss, involuntary return. The Gnostic texts, particularly those recovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, a genuine archaeological discovery that produced 52 texts suppressed by the early church, describe a soul recycling system maintained by beings called archons. The archons are not demons in the conventional sense. They are described as administrators. They maintain the material world and the cycle of souls. The Gnostics use the word hamarmin, fate, or necessity, to describe the force that binds the soul to this cycle. They believed this cycle was not natural and not benevolent. They believed it was constructed. And they believed that the only way out was a specific kind of knowledge, gnosis, that allowed the soul to recognize what was happening and refuse to be swept back in. Put those 3 traditions next to each other, Sumerian, Tibetan, Gnostic, and the overlap is not vague. It is specific. stage dissolution of identity, involuntary return, a system that runs on the soul's ignorance of itself. The knowledge to resist requires preparation before death, not after. And that knowledge was, in all three traditions, considered restricted, not freely available, held by initiates, passed carefully, protected. There is one more element in the Sumerian text that doesn't get the attention it deserves. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest complete epic in human history, is primarily read as a story about the fear of death. Gilgamesh watches his closest companion Enkidu die, and the death breaks him. He travels to the ends of the earth searching for immortality. He finds Utnapishtim, the one man granted eternal life by the gods. Utnapishtim tells him the secret is a plant at the bottom of the sea. Gilgamesh dives, retrieves it. A snake steals it while he sleeps. He returns home empty-handed. The standard reading is that the poem teaches acceptance of mortality. Death is inevitable, therefore live fully while you are alive. But the poem contains a detail that most readings skim over. When Enkidu dies, he does not simply stop. He lingers. His gidim survives. In a tablet fragment that is among the most damaged in the collection, Enkidu's ghost returns and speaks to Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh asks him what the underworld is like. And Enkidu's description is not peaceful. He describes levels. He describes the recently dead, who still remember their lives, still have some coherence. He describes others, further in, who no longer know their names. He describes the deepest levels as a place of dust and silence where even the memory of having been alive has faded entirely. That is a description of staged memory loss, written down approximately 4,000 years ago, before neuroscience, before any scientific framework for understanding how memory works, how identity is constructed, what consciousness actually is. And it maps with uncomfortable precision onto the same mechanism described in the Tibetan and Gnostic materials. The Sumerians were not primitive. They were the first civilization to write anything down at all. When they wrote about death, they wrote with the same precision they brought to astronomy, mathematics, and law. The assumption that their death cosmology is less accurate than their astronomical data has never been justified. It has only ever been assumed. Here is where this lands in the present day. There is a branch of medical research called near-death experience studies that has been quietly accumulating data for 50 years. The most rigorous long-term study, published in the Lancet in 2001 by Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel, followed 344 cardiac arrest patients over 8 years. 18% of them reported conscious experience during the period when they had no measurable brain activity. Clinically flat. No heartbeat, no brain function, no biological basis for experience of any kind. And yet they came back with coherent, specific, verifiable accounts. What they described varied in detail, but the structural elements were consistent. A separation from the body, a movement through space, an encounter with light, a life review, a rapid, non-judgmental panorama of everything they had experienced. What they did not describe in the vast majority of cases was what came next. The accounts stop at a certain point, and the person is back in the body. The Sumerian framework offers a specific reason for this. Those individuals did not reach the gates. They were returned before the process began. Their accounts describe the threshold, not the passage. The smaller percentage of accounts that do go further, the ones describing what the medical literature calls distressing near-death experiences, are the ones that almost never get the same coverage. Those accounts describe cold environments, silent figures, a sense of being processed rather than welcomed, a feeling of having been here before. Not a specific memory, but a structural familiarity, like a building you have never been in, but somehow know the layout of. The Sumerian texts do not tell you what to do with that. They describe the system. They name its components. They trace its logic. What they do not do is resolve it. The tablets are still there. The British Museum holds thousands of them. The translations are public. The cuneiform is legible, what the Sumerians wrote down 6,000 years ago, in a language they invented so the knowledge would survive, is available to anyone willing to read it. The question the Epic of Gilgamesh ends with is the same question the death tablets circle around without answering directly. Not what happens after you die. That, apparently, they knew. The question is whether knowing the mechanism gives you any power over it. Whether awareness of the gates changes what happens when you reach them. Whether the me of death, the fixed coded rules of the system, have any exceptions built in. The texts do not say, but the fact that multiple traditions across thousands of years all converged on the same conclusion, that the knowledge matters, that preparation matters, that dying in ignorance and dying in awareness are not the same thing, suggests the Sumerians believe the answer was yes. What you do with that is your own decision. But you are not supposed to have the information at all. Drop a comment telling me which part of this you think is most significant. I read everyone. Subscribe if you're not already here,